The plow truck's amber light swept across the yard at 2 in the morning, and Corvin Marsh stood at his frost-glazed window watching another wall of snow cascade across his property line. The 14th time in 6 weeks. He said nothing. He simply turned, walked to his basement, and began drawing plans for something the HOA board would never see coming until it was already too late to stop. The first time it happened, Corvin Marsh assumed it was an accident. He had watched from his kitchen window as the Cedarwood Ridge Homeowners Association's contracted plow truck, a battered yellow Peterbilt driven by a man named Dolph Rance, made a wide arc at the far end of the Tanglewood Circle and swung the blade low, sending a shoulder-high wave of packed snow surging over the property line and onto the narrow strip of land that Corvin owned between his driveway and the community retention area. The strip was only 19 feet wide. After the plow passed, it was buried under 2.5 feet of compacted gray slush. Corvin pulled on his coat, walked outside, and spent 40 minutes shoveling it clear. His back hurt afterward. He was 53 years old, and the cold had never agreed with his left shoulder since a construction accident 8 years prior that had left him with 2 steel pins and a scar shaped like a fishhook running beneath his collarbone. He finished, went inside, made coffee, and told himself it was a one-time mistake. The driver had misjudged his turn. It happened. It happened again 3 days later. This time the snow came with chunks of road grit and salt embedded in it, a mix so dense and heavy it cracked 2 of the bluestone pavers on the walking path Corvin had installed himself the summer before, laying each stone by hand over 3 humid weekends because he believed in doing things properly. He stood there looking at the broken stones for a long moment before retrieving his phone and calling the HOA's management office. The woman who answered was named Patrice Dunmore, and she served as both the administrative coordinator and the unofficial voice of HOA board president Gerald Feen. Corvin had dealt with her before, over a fence-staining dispute 2 years earlier that had ended with him receiving a violation notice despite being 3 shades within the approved color range. He knew her tone, polished, slightly bored, and capable of making dismissal sound like sympathy. "Mr. Marsh," she said, after he explained what had happened. "The snow removal contractor operates within the standard practices of the community. Winter maintenance of common area boundaries does involve some displacement of material. I can pass along your concern to the board." "This isn't a concern," Corvin said. "My property was damaged. 2 of my pavers are cracked. We'd need documentation of that. I have photographs. You can submit them through the resident portal. The board meets on the first Thursday of each month." He submitted the photographs that afternoon. He included timestamps, measurements, and a photograph of the property survey marker that clearly established where HOA responsibility ended and his land began. He was precise because he was a man who had spent 22 years as a civil engineer, and precision was not a habit he turned on and off. It was simply how he operated. The board responded 11 days later with a form letter. It acknowledged his submission, noted that the contractor had been reminded of proper snow placement protocols, and wished him a safe and pleasant winter. No apology. No mention of the damaged pavers. No commitment to reimbursement. Corvin read the letter twice, filed it in a folder labeled Cedarwood Ridge, and watched the window. The plow came back the following Tuesday. This time, Dolph Rance seemed to be doing it deliberately. Corvin had no way to prove intent from a distance, but the man slowed at the far end of the circle, positioned the truck at an angle that served no practical plowing purpose, and lowered the blade specifically to direct the accumulation toward the property line. The wave of snow that rolled over the marker was enormous, nearly 4 feet high, packed tight enough to require a metal spade to break through. Corvin went outside and spent an hour dealing with it. When he straightened up and looked toward the street, Dolph Rance's truck had stopped at the entrance of the circle. The man was watching him from the cab. When their eyes met, Rance revved the engine once and drove away. That was the moment Corvin understood that this was not carelessness. It was something deliberate and petty and protected by the institutional authority of a homeowners association that Gerald Feen had controlled for 7 consecutive years without a single contested board election. Gerald Feen lived in the largest house on Tanglewood Circle, a 4,000-square-foot colonial on the corner lot that had been assessed twice in the past decade because Feen himself had pushed through an interior renovation ordinance that benefited properties above 3,000 square feet. He drove a black Escalade and kept his driveway immaculate. He was 61 years old, thick through the chest, and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had mistaken neighborhood authority for actual power. He and Corvin had spoken exactly 4 times in 7 years. 3 of those conversations had ended with Feen citing HOA rules to dismiss something Corvin had raised. The 4th had been at a block party where Feen had told a story about a hunting trip and laughed too loudly at his own punchline. Corvin had never trusted him. He trusted him less now. He called the management office again and was again connected to Patrice Dunmore, who was again polished and slightly bored. "This is the third incident," Corvin said. "I want it on record that I observed the driver deliberately redirecting accumulated snow onto my property. Mr. Marsh, our contractor performs snow removal services across the entire community. I'm sure the driver was simply focused on completing the route. I have the timestamps of each incident and photographs of the resulting accumulation. I'm documenting a pattern. You're welcome to bring this before the board at the next meeting." When is the next meeting? February 4th. It was January 9th. Corvin was looking at 26 more days of potential incidents. "And in the meantime," he said, "what is the HOA's position on damage to private property caused by its contracted agents?" There was a brief pause. "I'd recommend consulting the Community Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions document. Section 12 addresses contractor liability." He already had the CCNRs. He had read them the previous night, all 84 pages, making notes in the margins with a red pen. Section 12 was not favorable to residents making damage claims against HOA contracted services unless the damage was direct, documented, and valued above a threshold of $1,200. His two cracked pavers had cost him $240 to install. The section also contained an arbitration clause that required any dispute to go through a three-person panel, two of whom were appointed by the board. Corvin closed the CCNR's document, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then opened a different folder on his desk, the one containing the original property survey he had commissioned when he bought the house 9 years ago. He spread it across the kitchen table and studied it carefully, the way he used to study site plans before beginning a major construction project. He looked at dimensions. He looked at easements. He looked at setback lines and boundary markers and the exact legal description of his property. Then he looked at the retention area, the community retention area, a low-lying quarter-acre parcel used for stormwater management, sat adjacent to his property, separated by that 19-foot strip of land he owned. The HOA maintained it, but they did not own it. The land was governed by a drainage easement held by the county, and the HOA had maintenance access rights but not exclusive use rights. More importantly, the retention area sat at a lower elevation than the surrounding properties. The natural grade sloped toward it from three directions, including from the east, where Gerald Fiend's driveway and the driveways of his three closest neighbors formed a continuous band of pavement. Corvin measured everything with a surveyor's wheel the following morning, walking the perimeter of his strip in the cold, gray dawn while his breath misted and the neighborhood was still quiet. He wrote numbers in a small notebook. He took photographs with his phone, geotagged, with the date and timestamps enabled. When he got back inside, he made a sketch on graph paper, scaling it precisely at 1 inch to 4 feet, the way he had done for 22 years on job sites. He looked at the sketch for a long time. Then he drove to the hardware store. He was not buying a snowblower. He was not buying salt or a new shovel. He purchased 14 bags of water-absorbent polymer concrete mix, 2 coils of flexible form board, a box of rebar stakes, a cordless drill, and a bag of tie wire. He loaded it all into his truck without hurrying. The cashier asked if he was doing a repair job. Corvin said he was making a small retaining feature along a property line. The cashier nodded and didn't ask anything further. Back home, he moved everything to his garage and locked the door. He waited 3 days until the next snowfall was forecast, a significant one, 12 to 16 inches according to the Weather Service. And then, at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, as the first flurries started and the temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, Corvin Marsh went to work. He had designed a low snow-catch barrier. Not a wall, technically. Not in the legal sense that might trigger a permit requirement. The structure was 11 inches tall, which kept it below the 12-inch threshold defined in the county's accessory structure code as requiring a permit. It ran the full 19-foot width of his property strip, positioned precisely 6 inches inside his surveyed property line, anchored with rebar stakes driven 18 inches into the frozen ground, which Corvin had pre-loosened with a rented auger 2 days earlier. The form board was shaped in a gentle concave curve so that any snow pushed against it from the HOA side would deflect upward and back in the direction it had come. The concrete he poured in the dark, working under a battery-powered work light, mixing each bag in a wheelbarrow with water he had pre-warmed in his garage. He worked efficiently and without wasted motion. By 8:30 that night, the structure was formed and beginning to cure. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees. At 14 degrees, properly mixed polymer concrete would set slower but harder than in temperate conditions, especially if covered during the initial cure period. Corvin covered it with insulating blanket, weighted at the edges with sandbags. He went inside, ate dinner, and went to bed. The snow fell through the night. 12 inches by morning, 16 by noon, with another 2 arriving before it stopped at 4 in the afternoon. Corvin watched it accumulate from his window without concern. His driveway connected directly to the street from the opposite side of his property, well away from the strip. He was in no hurry. The plow came at 7 in the evening. He watched Dolph Rance make the same arc at the far end of Tanglewood Circle, position the truck at the same deliberate angle, and send the same enormous wave of compacted snow and grit rolling toward the property line. The wave hit the barrier at speed, climbed its concave face, and broke backward over itself, depositing the majority of the displaced snow on the HOA's side of the line in a dense, compacted mound, roughly 3 feet high and running the full width of the strip. Dolph Rance stopped the truck. Even from his kitchen window, Corvin could see the hesitation. The driver moved forward, repositioned, and pushed the blade against the mound again. The barrier held. The snow redirected. Rance got out of the truck, walked to the barrier, crouched down, and looked at it for a moment. Then he got back in the truck and drove away. Corvin allowed himself one small, controlled exhale. He did not smile. Not yet. There was too much left to do, and the board's response to this development was going to be the thing that determined how far this would ultimately go. He found out how far it would go the next morning when he discovered a violation notice tucked into his door jamb, citing Section 7.4 of the CC&Rs, which governed the construction of accessory structures. The notice listed the barrier as an unauthorized structure, demanded its removal within 72 hours, and included a fine of $300 for noncompliance. Corvin read the violation notice the way he read engineering specifications, looking for errors, inconsistencies, or clauses that contradicted other clauses. He found 3. Section 7.4 applied specifically to accessory structures within the community's common areas and shared boundaries. His barrier was on his private land. Section 7.4 also specified a minimum height of 12 inches as the threshold for permit review, and his barrier was 11 inches. And the fine schedule cited in the notice referenced a 2019 amendment to the fee structure that had, according to county property records Corvin had already pulled, never been formally recorded with the county clerk, which potentially rendered it unenforceable under state HOA Statute 47F. He spent that afternoon on the phone with a property rights attorney named Diane Thrush, whose office was 40 minutes away in Raleigh. She had been referred to him by a colleague who had once fought a similar boundary dispute with a different HOA and won. Corvin laid out the facts precisely and without editorializing. Diane Thrush asked 3 clarifying questions, made 2 notes, and said, "The violation notice has no legal standing if your structure is within your property boundaries and below the permitting threshold. The fine is also problematic if the amendment wasn't recorded properly. I'd like to see the survey and the CC&Rs." He emailed everything to her office that evening. While he waited for her review, the plow came back twice more. Each time, the redirected snow added to the growing mound on the HOA's side of the barrier. By the second week of February, the mound was nearly 6 feet high and 15 feet wide, compacted by repeated additions and nightly freezing into a mass that was, in practical terms, no longer snow. It was ice. Dense, structural ice, bonded to itself in layers the way glacial formations develop, carrying within it gravel, road salt, and the dark organic stain of exhaust particulate. Gerald Feen's response was to call an emergency board meeting. Corvin received the meeting notice 2 days in advance. He arrived at the community clubhouse at exactly 7 in the evening, signed in, and took a seat in the back row. The room held 14 people, 8 residents and the 5-member board, plus Patrice Dunmore at her folding table with her laptop and her recorder. Gerald Feen sat at the center of the board table in a red Patagonia fleece vest and looked at Corvin the way people look at something they intend to manage. "The purpose of tonight's emergency session," Feen said, "is to address the unauthorized structure erected by Mr. Marsh on the eastern boundary of the community, adjacent to the retention area. The board's position is that this structure is in violation of Section 7.4 and represents a hazard to community maintenance operations." Corvin raised his hand. Feen ignored it. Board member Sylvia Crane, a retired pharmacist who Corvin had always found to be the only reasonable person on the 5-member panel, said quietly, "Gerald, let him speak." Feen looked at Sylvia for a moment with something that was not quite irritation but adjacent to it. Then he gestured at Corvin with 2 fingers. Corvin stood. "The structure in question is 11 inches in height, entirely within my surveyed property boundaries, and does not meet the definition of an accessory structure under Section 7.4, which applies to structures within common areas. I have a legal opinion confirming this." He set 3 copies of Diane Thrush's preliminary written assessment on the table and slid one toward Fiend, one toward the board secretary, and one toward Patrice Dunmore. I also have documentation of 14 separate incidents in which the HOA's contracted snow removal service deposited accumulated material on my private property, causing damage to installed hardscape. I would like that damage to be addressed before the board spends any further time discussing a structure that is legally mine to maintain. The room was quiet for a moment. Fiend picked up the assessment, glanced at it, and set it down. "This is a letter from an attorney. It's not a court ruling." "No," Corvin said, "but it will be relevant when I file the nuisance claim next week." Another silence. Longer this time. Sylvia Crane looked at Fiend. "Gerald, has the board reviewed the documentation Mr. Marsh previously submitted about the snow displacement incidents?" "We reviewed the photographs." "And what was the board's determination?" "That the contractor was operating within standard practice." "Even with a pattern of 14 incidents all directed at the same property line?" Fiend's jaw moved slightly. "The contractor's route is efficient and consistent." "Consistent is certainly one word for it," Corvin said. Fiend pointed at him. "You're out of order, Mr. Marsh. I'm a property owner at a public meeting whose taxes fund this community association. I don't think I'm out of order at all." The meeting went for another 50 minutes. Nothing was resolved. The board voted 3-2, Sylvia and a newer member named Hector Baez dissenting, to reissue the violation notice and escalate the fine to $500. Corvin noted the vote, thanked the board for their time, and left. In the parking lot, Hector Baez caught up with him. "For what it's worth," Baez said, "I think you have a real case." "I know I do," Corvin said. "That's not what worries me." "What worries you?" Corvin looked back at the clubhouse, where through the glass door he could see Gerald Fiend talking to Patrice Dunmore with the focused energy of someone planning a next move. "What worries me is how far they're willing to go before they realize they've made this irreversible." He drove home through the dark. The ice wall along his property line caught his headlights as he turned into his driveway, pale, massive, and utterly immovable. He had not built it to be a weapon. He had built it to be a boundary. But boundaries, he had learned, have a way of becoming something larger when people refuse to respect them. He went inside, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and sat down at his kitchen table with the survey map spread before him. He looked at it for a long time, tracing the property lines with his fingertip in the cold, quiet house. The ice wall glittered under the streetlight outside his window. It was not finished yet. Not by a long measure. February arrived with the kind of cold that did not relent. The temperature climbed above freezing exactly once in the first 2 weeks, for a single afternoon that did little more than glaze the existing accumulation in a thin layer of meltwater before it refroze overnight into a surface as hard and reflective as polished stone. Corvin's ice wall had by this point grown to a height of nearly 8 feet, fed by 11 additional plow passes since the board meeting. Dolph Rance had apparently not been told to stop. Whether this was Fiend's instruction or Rance's own stubborn continuation of the pattern, Corvin could not say with certainty. The result was the same either way. The wall was no longer something a reasonable person could ignore. Several of Corvin's neighbors had begun to notice it. Margaret Solano, who lived 2 houses down and had always been cordial to Corvin in the manner of people who maintain careful neutrality in neighborhood disputes, stopped on one of her evening walks to look at it. "That's quite something," she said. "Yes," Corvin agreed. "It is. Did you build all that?" "The HOA's plow contractor built it," Corvin said pleasantly. "I provided the redirection." He explained the barrier, the property line, the plow's consistent angle of approach. Margaret Solano listened with the careful attention of someone who was recalibrating her previous understanding of a situation. She asked 2 questions. Both were good ones. When she walked away, she was quiet, in a way that suggested she was going to think about this for some time. 2 days later, Corvin learned that Margaret Solano had emailed the board to ask why the HOA's snow removal contractor appeared to be depositing community snow on a private resident's land. He learned this because Sylvia Crane called him to tell him so, and also to tell him that 3 other residents had made similar inquiries after seeing the wall. "Gerald is not happy," Sylvia said. She had a dry, even voice that Corvin had come to appreciate. She said what she meant without embellishment. "I imagine not," Corvin said. "He's talking about pursuing injunctive relief to force the removal of your barrier. He'd need to demonstrate that the barrier constitutes a nuisance or a hazard. The legal basis for that is thin at best, given that it's within my property and below the permitting threshold." "I know. I told him that. He didn't appreciate hearing it." "He rarely does," Corvin said. "Sylvia, can I ask you something directly?" You can try. When the board reviewed my snow displacement documentation in January, did they actually look at it? Or did Gerald determine the outcome before the meeting and the vote was a formality? There was a short pause. I think you already know the answer to that. I think I do, Corvin said. Thank you. He hung up and called Diane Thrush. The nuisance claim was filed that week, citing the 14 documented snow displacement incidents, the 2 cracked pavers, the pattern of conduct constituting a continuing private nuisance under North Carolina common law, and the HOA's repeated failure to remedy the situation despite formal notice. Diane attached the photographs, the timestamps, the violation notices the board had sent him, and the preliminary engineer's assessment she had requested from a colleague who reviewed the plow truck's trajectory based on Corvin's measurements and photographs and concluded in writing that the angle of approach served no functional plowing purpose and was inconsistent with efficient route maintenance. That last document was the one Corvin was most proud of. It transformed a subjective complaint about a neighbor's rudeness into an objective finding of misdirected contractor conduct. The HOA's attorney, a man named Terrence Prohl who operated out of a one-man office in Durham and charged the community association $600 per hour for services Corvin suspected were often rendered by a paralegal, sent a response letter 9 days after the filing. The letter denied all claims, asserted that snow displacement was a normal incident of winter maintenance, and included a counterfiling asserting that Corvin's barrier constituted an illegal obstruction of the HOA's maintenance access to the retention area easement. Corvin read the counterfiling carefully and found the argument interesting because it was wrong in a way that was going to cost Gerald Feen considerable money to discover. The maintenance access easement for the retention area was a county-granted right, not an HOA-granted right. It ran perpendicular to Corvin's property strip, providing access from the street. Corvin's barrier was parallel to the property line and obstructed nothing along the access path. The counterfiling was, in Diane Thrush's precise assessment, a creative misreading of easement law that would not survive a motion to dismiss. She filed the motion to dismiss. The court granted it in 17 days. Gerald Feen's response to the dismissal was visible in the way he carried himself when Corvin saw him at the mailbox one afternoon in the 3rd week of February. The man looked like someone who had been told something he did not believe and was not yet ready to accept. He looked at Corvin across 40 feet of frozen lawn and said, loud enough to carry clearly in the cold air, "You think you're very clever." Corvin retrieved his mail without hurrying. "I think I'm accurate," he said, "which is usually more useful." "This isn't over," Feen said. "No," Corvin agreed, "it isn't." He walked back to his house without looking back. But the thing that Feen could not see, and that Corvin had been watching develop for 2 weeks with the careful attention of an engineer observing a structure under load, was the way the ice wall was changing the hydrology of the corner. The plow's continuous deposits had not only built the wall higher, they had extended it outward along the base, spreading laterally until the mass of ice now formed a rough crescent shape that curved gently inward at both ends, the natural consequence of snow being pushed against a curved barrier by a truck that approached at a slight angle. The crescent's northern horn had grown to within 3 feet of the edge of the retention area. The southern horn had grown to within 6 feet of the mouth of the shared access lane that connected Tanglewood Circle's 4 corner properties, including Gerald Feen's, to the main road. Corvin measured the crescent every 3 days. He knew what would happen when the temperature finally broke. He had calculated it during the 2nd week of January, sitting at his kitchen table with a coffee that had gone cold while he worked through the math. The retention area sat 18 inches lower than the surrounding grade. The crescent of ice sat at grade level on the HOA side. When temperatures rose above freezing and